Good morning, everyone. My name is David Edick. I am president of the San Diego World Affairs Council, and we are here gathered this morning to hear from UC San Diego Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and more, Mr. Dr. Michael Provence. Dr. Provence teaches modern Middle East history, focusing on the 20th century Arab East. He received a BA in history from UC Berkeley in 1994 and a PhD from the University of Chicago in 2001. During 2017 through 2018, he was a fellow in residence in France at a university that I cannot pronounce and will not try at 2010 through 11. And again in 2014, Dr. Provence was a Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. In 2024-2025, currently, Michael is a visiting professor at the University Paris, and is calling in tonight, his time, from France. Dr. Provence is the author of 2 books and many articles. The books are The Great Syrian Revolt and The Rise of Arab Nationalism. He also has written The Last Ottoman Generation and The Making of the Modern Middle East. Both books are available in Arabic and in Turkish. Michael Provence lived and studied over the course of many years in several Middle Eastern countries, particularly Syria and Lebanon, between 1998 and 2006. He returns as often as possible. So please, a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Provence, the first episode of the San Diego State World Affairs Council's Levant month. Dr. Provence, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you from cold, rainy, dark Marseille, back in San Diego. But I understand it's rainy there too, so that's good. I lived in Syria for 2.5 years and a bit longer, and including Lebanon. So about 3.5 years. I'm going to go visit Lebanon next month, and maybe, I hope, I'll go to Damascus for the first time since 2006, but we'll see. So I was a Fulbright student there, and then a Fulbright Hayes student, and then a Fulbright senior scholar at the American University of Beirut in those years, and they were really some of the very best years of my life. And I developed a really deep admiration and love for the country and its people and its culture, and I'm really very intimately connected, I think, to Syria and to its people. So I wanted to divide my comments today in 3 parts, 3 episodes really, that seem to me would sort of, it's a lot to cover. Dave asked me to talk about really the early days of the country as a French colonial territory, as a French colonial mandate. And I'm going to do that, but the way that I'm going to do it is by breaking it into these 3 episodes. So I want to talk about the period of the First World War and after. I want to talk about the period after the Second World War, when the United States came to Syria and began to play an outsized role. And that section will actually be based on new research that I've done that I haven't talked about in any forum until now. So that I hope it holds together. I think it may be surprising, some of the things I have to say. And then finally, the third part, I'm going to talk about the coming of the Assad government in 1970 and the period from 1970 to 2024, and not a tremendous amount of detail, and based in some cases on memories and things that I experienced while I lived there. During the time that I lived in Syria, Hafez al-Assad, the president of 30 years, died. The new president, Bashar al-Assad, now gone, now in exile in Russia, came to power. I also witnessed an election for both of them, referendums really, and a whole bunch of other pretty earth-shattering events during those years of the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, over this whole discussion here, I want to focus on a couple of themes or things that I want to point out. Now, since the very beginning, Syria is a new country. It's a very ancient land. It's the cradle of civilization in some ways, of the agricultural revolution, maybe the first city, continually inhabited human settlement is there. Some people think that Damascus was the inspiration for the story of the Garden of Eden, a city on the edge of an arid zone that was well watered and fruitful and abundant, because it has this river that comes down from the mountain and creates a huge area of orchards and streams. So it's a very historic country, but as a country itself, it's new and it's small. And it's invented, or was invented, I would say, by ill-willed people in 1920, which is to say the French and British colonial civil servants, ill-willed people against the wishes of the inhabitants. What I mean by that is that the people who lived there had no say in the arrangements by which they found themselves and the state that was organized in 1920. And that what they wanted at that time in 1918, 1920 was a bigger, more free, more democratic, less fragmented country than what they got under the post-World War I colonial settlement that emerged. So from that period until now, I would say the abiding priority of Syrian politics at the highest level, the international affairs level, has been avoiding the prospect of becoming a pawn of larger powers, larger malevolent powers in the region and outside the region, and struggling, I would say, mightily against fragmentation, division, and weakness on the part of the state. Now, this is a manifestation of the history of the country as being a fragment or a small piece of what people expected Syria to be in the period around the First World War. So I'm going to share my screen now and show some images. This is the poster from the T.E. Lawrence Arabia, David Lean movie that I think probably lots of people have seen. And it's the way that people have thought about, or it's the way that people understand in this country, in the United States, not so much in France, but here too on some level, what Syria represents and what happened there during the First World War. But Lawrence, was a minor figure, and the Arab Revolt, despite the epic movie, was a minor event in a period of the First World War. And the First World War, historians argued today, lately, over the last 10 years or so, especially during the period since the centennial of the First World War, the First World War was a war to settle something that had been called the Eastern question. And you can see on my screen here, on your screen, you can see this cartoon from a French illustrated weekly from 1908 showing the question, la question de Orient, or the Eastern question. So the Eastern question was the abiding concern of almost all 19th century diplomacy for the European powers, for Britain, for France, for Germany, and for Russia. Simply stated, the question was, what would happen to the Ottoman realms? Who would profit from the Ottoman partition? Who would be able to seize, occupy, hold, colonize Ottoman territory? Now, this is a map of the Ottoman Empire, and Syria, of course, what we can call Greater Syria here, which is from the area on the, I wonder if I have a, can you see my cursor there? Or maybe only I can see it.
Yes, I can see it. Go ahead.
Okay. So this is Aqaba on the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba here. Greater Syria is all of this area up here until these mountains here, the Taurus Mountains. So this is Greater Syria. The states that make up today's Lebanon, Syria, part of Turkey, part of Iraq, Jordan, and Israel, including part of Sinai. So this is Greater Syria. And this was one region under the Ottoman state with one language, no rule, no borders, no divisions of any kind. And at the time of the First World War and after, this is what people in the region wanted to form as a state. But the war was fought, as I say, to settle the Eastern question. This is a cartoon. I think lots of people can understand the French here. It says, how shall we divide the croissant? Now, what this means is, of course, we have here a British caricature, a French caricature, Marianne, and a Russian caricature. And the issue here, the question, it says the bakery of the Balkans, or the furnace of the Balkans, is to divide Turkey, the crescent, which is the Ottoman state. This cartoon actually predates the First World War. This is during the Balkan War, which was the opening salvo to the First World War. Here's another cartoon. You can see they're tearing apart the territories of the Ottoman state and claiming them. So Syria emerged in 1920 from this process and from the war. But during the course of the war, the British government, which had most of its forces in the Middle East, in Egypt, which had become a colony in the 19th century to guard the Suez Canal, British forces fought the Ottomans in Palestine and finally defeated the Ottoman state in Damascus in October of 1918. But before that happened, the British government had made a promise to a family of a person called Sharif Hussein. This is the star. I think he's the Omar Sharif character in the David Lean movie. A person called Amir or Prince Faisal. Here's a picture of him. So Faisal was T.E. Lawrence's friend and his colleague in this revolt. And Faisal and his father were promised by the British government an Arab state that would expand. This is what they believed they were promised, this entire area. And here's a map of it as they envisioned it. This is Greater Syria. In 1915, they were promised this. Now, the reason for this was because the British government was afraid that they would be defeated, possibly defeated by the Ottoman army, which turned out to be far more formidable than anyone expected. And so the promise was made: we will give you this if you raise a revolt against the Ottoman state. And that's the context, the backstory of the famous movie. But the problem was that Britain needed France more than it needed this Arab revolt. And in 1915 and in 1916, the situation on the Western Front, but also in the East, after the Gallipoli campaign and the surrender of an entire British army in a place called Kut in Mesopotamia or Iraq, right around here, with the capture of something like some tens of thousands of British soldiers, had made the situation very tenuous for the British government. And so in 1916, a British diplomat named Mark Sykes went to Paris and said to a French diplomat, a person named François-Georges Picot, and they came up with something called the Sykes-Picot Accord, which was the partition of the Arabic-speaking Ottoman territories. A and blue was France, B and red was Britain. They couldn't come to a decision about Palestine. The British wanted it, the French wanted it, and so they said it'll be an international zone. And we colored it an in-between color. This is the actual map, and this is their signatures down here at the bottom. This is their pencil marks. They colored it in with their own colored pencils. Now, the reason that the British promise was so expansive was that Britain needed France to stay in the war, because if the British government was left on its own and France made a separate peace with Germany, which was very possible from the perspective of 1916, Britain would be by itself, and the British Empire in Egypt and in India and elsewhere would be imperiled by German and by Ottoman forces. And so France was promised far more even than they expected to get by Mark Sykes in 1916. And so the following year, the British government was doing much better, and the Palestine campaign was more successful. And in November, it became obvious that the British government and the British army was going to capture Jerusalem, and had already captured Baghdad. And so the British government was trying to figure out a way to go back on what had already been promised to France. And the Balfour Declaration, promising Palestine to the Zionist movement, was the mechanism by which that arrangement with the French was somehow abrogated. And so those are the agreements that give the region its terrible, miserable inheritance until today. And you can see why the people of the region have been struggling since then over geographical fragmentation and division by sectarian group, by religion, and that the states that emerged from the Sykes-Picot Accord, and if you look at the map, you can see that these lines resemble quite a bit what is there today, and that the countries that were on the map were designed to be weak by the British and the French, designed to be weak, fragmented, and divided. And that this unhappiness and political difficulty and conflict was actually baked in by design from the moment of 1918, 1919, and 1920. Now, about this time, in 1917, early in 1917, British or American President Woodrow Wilson decided that he would enter the war for various reasons. He had campaigned the year before on the campaign promise, he kept us out of the war. But in 1917, the calculus had changed. But Wilson needed an ideological cover and a kind of a propaganda campaign in order to sell his determination to intervene in the war to the American public. The way that he did this was by issuing a 14-point speech and saying, this is a war to make the world safe for democracy. Now, the other fellows here, Georges Clemenceau, the guy with the walrus mustache, the French premier, and David Lloyd George to the left with his finger in the chest of Vittorio, I think the Italian premier, knew that it wasn't a war to make the world safe for democracy. It was a war to make the world safe for empire. But they went along with this idea. Once the war was over, this is the medal that the participants got. Whether they survived, it went to their descendants, or whether if they didn't survive, it went to their descendants. I have one of these. This one here. This is the American version, which I think belonged to my great uncle, my mother's great uncle. And this is the French version, and this is the British version. And there were also Serbian versions and others. So this was the propaganda arrangement, and this was the argument that was made. And Wilson wrote something called the Charter of the New League of Nations to make this case that there had been something idealistic, something important, and that consent of the governed was an important component and a priority of the war that had just been fought. You can see this line down here at the bottom. This is something that he wrote himself. Certain communities belonging to the Turkish Empire. So the wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory state. But this was already impossible. France was going to get what it had been promised, and Britain was going to get what it had been promised. For Britain, it was Iraq, what became Transjordan, and Palestine. For France, it was Syria, or the northern part of what might have been Greater Syria, later to become Lebanon, the small country of Greater Lebanon. Wilson sent a group of people to go. Wait a minute, what happened to I lost my slide. Wilson sent something called the King Crane Commission in order to survey the wishes of the population. And then he suppressed, or someone suppressed this commission. But the commission went to Syria and to Lebanon and to Palestine, and they found that of all the people who lived there, 90% of them didn't want a mandate, didn't want Britain and France, didn't want Zionism, didn't want to be divided, didn't want to have separate countries, didn't want to have their states arranged by sectarian or religious identity, didn't want anything but independence, freedom, and democracy. And most of all, what they didn't want was fragmentation. But Wilson's commission was ignored. He had a stroke. The League of Nations was never ratified by the US Senate. And Syria spent the next 26 years as a mandate under the French government. Palestine became a British mandate. Transjordan and Iraq became British mandates. Palestine became a mandate divided between the Zionist population, who were represented at the League of Nations, and the indigenous population, then about 90% of the population, later a smaller percentage as the immigration from Europe, and especially from the rise of fascism, increased the number of Jewish inhabitants in the Palestine Mandate. In France, the country was divided into all of these little statelets, or mini-states. First, the state of Greater Lebanon. These were all arranged by religion. And the French government and the architect of Syria and Lebanon, who was a single individual named Robert Decaille, argued that they couldn't possibly live together, and that they needed to be separated, and that only France could protect the people of the region from fanaticism and from killing each other. But in fact, it was colonialism that caused these problems, and that it was colonialism that led to this fragmentation. So this was the inheritance of the mandate: sectarian rule, fragmentation, geographical fragmentation, and division by religion of people in the region, in Syria and particularly in Lebanon. Political power, economic power was apportioned to the minorities, and the larger Muslim population was generally disenfranchised during the course of the mandate and even after. So I'm going to go on to the next section here of what I want to talk about. How am I doing, Dave? Is it hanging together?
It is hanging together. Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So now what I want to talk about is the collapse of the mandates and the emergence of the United States as a global power. And this takes place during the course of 1945 and 1946. In 1945, General de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, decided that Winston Churchill is trying to cheat him out of Syria. And he decides that despite the fact that France and Britain had been fighting together in Syria during the Second World War, he was going to send French troops to reinforce the mandate in Syria. De Gaulle had promised Churchill that the Syrians and the Lebanese would be granted independence in exchange for help from the British government during the course of the Second World War. At the same time, President Truman invited the Syrian delegation to come to the organizational meeting of the United Nations in San Francisco in April of 1945, and this photograph is from that moment. The man signing is Feras al-Khoury, who was an American university-trained lawyer, the writer of the Syrian Constitution, Syrian Prime Minister, Presbyterian Protestant, and during the course of this trip, he also received an honorary doctorate from the University of Southern California. He went on the tour. He was internationally famous for his speech that he gave, a rousing defense of Syrian unity and Syrian independence in San Francisco. Truman said, well, I won't say what he said because it was pretty obscene, but when he heard this speech, he said, "How could such a people as that not be free?" At the same time, General de Gaulle was shelling the Syrian parliament in Damascus, and Churchill said that the French would have to evacuate, or else they would be dislodged by British troops themselves in April of 1945. De Gaulle said, "I will go to war against you, but right now I can't do it." And he was talking about Winston Churchill. He was talking about going to war against. So President Truman had organized the United Nations, and his administration had helped organize the United Nations, and they had resolved to prevent some of the mistakes of the League of Nations of the post-World War I period, which is to say, by not acknowledging the equal rights of people and nations around the world. The League of Nations had been predicated on the idea of white supremacy, of European colonialism, of empire. The United Nations was, at least in theory, would be different. People would have the right of self-representation. And Feras al-Khoury's presence there was proof of this idea. And he went in and gave a speech, which, as I say, was famous. The French were forced to evacuate Syria, and Syria became independent. A little bit later that year, in July of 1945, the Potsdam Conference took place. Now, does anybody realize why Churchill is in one picture and not in the other? side knows, the reason, of course, is that Churchill was defeated in a landslide during the course of the Potsdam Conference. And Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, this fellow here, became the Prime Minister during the course of the conference. Attlee promised to bring home the goods to the British public. The sacrifices had been very great. You can see this sign here, this was in Berlin at the same time as the Potsdam Conference, virtually, which was right down the road. Potsdam is really close. It says, "We want bread, we want coal." Well, actually, I've got it backwards, but we need heat, we want heat, we want bread. So rebuilding for Attlee, for the British government, decolonization and a retreat from empire and its costs and unequal benefits was a priority. And for the British public, this was a priority too. Churchill stood for the empire, and people didn't want the empire in 1945. They wanted bread, freedom, prosperity, and peace at home. Attlee also introduced the National Health Service to the British government, to the British public, as part of his immediate plan. But Truman picked up the mantle, not on purpose right away, but pretty quickly. And in order to rebuild Europe, he launched something called the Marshall Plan, with General George Marshall here on the left. And part of the idea of the Marshall Plan was that Germany, France, Britain would be resupplied and kept out of the Soviet camp by the transfer of American funds and American resources, and most especially petroleum, oil, for rebuilding and reconstructing devastated post-war Europe. And so Truman launched the Marshall Plan, and he intended to ship oil to rebuild Europe, but not from the places that the United States had gotten its oil from up until that point. The oil was going to come from a new American concession that had been signed about a decade before with the King Abdulaziz Saud of Saudi Arabia. And the company that had gained the concession was called Standard Oil of California, which we know as Chevron, recently moved to Texas. And Standard Oil of California had the concession for all Saudi oil and had formed a company called American Arabian, or the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco. And Aramco was going to build a pipeline that would go all the way from the oil fields in the Saudi oil fields to the Mediterranean. The original terminus was supposed to be Haifa, but Haifa had become impossible in 1946 and 1947 because of the war in Palestine that was when Attlee decolonized and evacuated Palestine. The Zionist movement launched a war in order to consolidate the state, seize the state for Zionism, and ultimately to expel most of the indigenous population to the surrounding states, to Gaza and to the West Bank. So Haifa was impossible as a terminus for this pipeline. So the contractor, Bechtel, formerly headquartered in San Francisco, now in Texas. I guess, is Chevron really in Texas now? I think they just moved.
Yeah, they've moved. Yeah.
100 years in San Ramon. Anyway, so the pipeline was built, and the problem was that the brand new Syrian government said, well, we have a democracy and we have a parliament, and we don't want to have foreign entanglements, and we don't want to have an oil pipeline from a great power coming through our country. And so we're not willing to do this. Now, Churchill had sent a new diplomat whose name I'm not going to tell you right now, but this is from his archives, his personal archives, which I recently visited. And this is his house that he built in Damascus in 1946, which at that time was bigger than the Syrian presidential mansion. And when I lived in Damascus, it was still the ambassadorial residence, and it had a pool. And because I was a Fulbrighter, I got to swim in the pool, which in August in Damascus was a really nice thing to be able to do. And this was the new embassy building. It was still the American embassy in 2012 when it closed. And it had been the embassy from 1946 when it was built until, like I say, it closed in 2012. It's got a big wall around it now, but it's still there, and it's still the embassy, the American embassy. Now, the embassy building and the new ambassador allowed or received money from the brand new CIA and the State Department for the purposes of persuading the new Syrian democratically elected parliamentary civilian government to allow the oil pipeline to go through the country. And the way that this was done was that a unscrupulous, probably alcoholic and certainly corrupt Syrian army colonel was approached and paid to overthrow the democratic government in April of 1949. Now, I think that a lot of people here understand that the first CIA coup was in Iran, but this is actually not the case. The first CIA coup was in Syria in 1949, and this man, Colonel Hosni Zaim, was the person who was put on in office by the CIA from the new American embassy. And these are documents that prove it. The one on the left is from the French archives, and the one on the right is from a private document. None of this has been published, and so I'm not going to let you look at it too much because I'm waiting to publish it, and I don't want anybody to beat me to it, obviously. In that year of 1949, there were two other coups. Hosni Zaim, on the day after he was put in office, signed off on the tap line accord to build the pipeline. And he also signed off on a currency accord with the French government, which the French had wanted. And the French were very happy. And that's why I was in the French archives looking for this. They were very happy because they thought, oh, we're going to be able to use those silly Americans to get back at the British at last. And so the archives and the diplomatic correspondence make really rather interesting reading. But Hosni Zaim didn't last very long, but he lasted long enough. He also volunteered to resettle Palestinian refugees permanently in Syria in exchange for money for the Syrian treasury and also money for him personally, which the embassy was happy to entertain and to arrange. But he was overthrown by more, I guess we could say, more patriotic members of the general staff, and they executed him about 6 months later, while the ambassador was on holiday out of the country in Switzerland, not coincidentally. And then a little later, the next coup came along, and that man, a person named Adib Shishakli, was also a CIA asset, and he stayed in power until 1954. So, as you can imagine, with a country with a turbulent beginning like that, having been defeated by Israel in 1948, when the country was only independent for a year, having had the first democratically elected government overthrown within 3 years, having three coups in 1 year. The abiding determination of Syrian statecraft became trying to avoid being drawn into other conflicts and trying to avoid becoming a pawn of great power politics in the region generally. And so that takes us to what I want to say about the last part of the talk here, which is the period from about 1970 until 2024, until December. Now, there was a political party that had emerged during the 1940s and 50s called the Ba'ath Party, which means Renaissance in Arabic. And if you remember those themes that I was talking about, opposition to fragmentation, division by sect, and weakness, you can imagine that this party and the idea of things like Arab unity was an important element in what they called, and what this was. I mean, this was the Renaissance Party. So the slogan here, the logo says the Arab Syrian Socialist Ba'ath Party, with a united Arab nation with an eternal mission, unity, freedom, and socialism. And so the idea of this party and of politics generally from the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, you can see became these ideas. And part of the reason, of course, is that Syria was and is a diverse religious country, a religiously diverse country like Lebanon, like all of the Arab countries, really, with a number of religious sects. And so there was a feeling that a secular, nationalist, democratic country could represent the rights of everybody equally. And so this was the dream, the intention of this. And you see that this is the map here that incorporates all 22 countries of the Arab League. The idea that all of these countries are going to be united. So now, what actually happened during the 50s and into the 60s was that a series of big disasters and setbacks came. And in every case, when these happened, the civilians were shunted aside, and the military blamed the civilians for the disasters. So the photograph on your right is Gamal Abdel Nasser, or President Nasser of Egypt, Nuruddin al-Atassi of Syria, who was the civilian, he was a physician, Ba'ath Party leader from 1966 onward, and his defense minister, Hafez al-Assad, this fella behind here. This is King Hussein of Jordan. This is Abdel Hakim Amr of Egypt, and there's Nasser again. In 1967, Israel invaded Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon and Jordan, and captured Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And immediately the UN said that in order for there to be peace, all of these places should be evacuated by the Israeli forces. The only place that was evacuated was Sinai, because the Egyptians were sufficiently strong. And of course, Jimmy Carter's diplomacy played a big role in this as well. The defense minister of Syria overthrew the civilian leader, put him in prison, and started a new regime, which came to be the regime of Hafez al-Assad from 1970 until his death in 2000. And this was the Ba'athist government of Assad that was in power when I went to Syria in 1998. and he had been in power at that time for 28 years. There was this struggle against fragmentation, division, and weakness, and the effort to not be a pawn of other states retained the importance for Assad's state. And he was successful. There were no more coups. He took Syria off the game board as a pawn. It became a country that was, with Soviet help, able to challenge the Israelis in 1973, to intervene decisively and catastrophically, I think almost anyone would say, in the Lebanese Civil War in 1976, to fight a Cold War against Iraq of Saddam during this period. And there was some unity and some socialism and no freedom in these 30 years. And over time, there was less and less freedom and less prosperity. And the institutions of the state were progressively hollowed out over this period. But the countryside was well taken care of. Excuse me. Syria had clean water for almost everybody, electricity almost everywhere, education almost everywhere, pretty good universities, trained thousands and thousands of physicians, many of whom ended up practicing in the United States and are still practicing in the United States, including at UCSD Hospital. And for people who were not interested in politics, it was possible to sometimes, for a while in the 70s and 80s, have a reasonably prosperous, decent life. But the economy got weaker and weaker and weaker. And then in 2000, I think you'll recognize some of these people. This is this guy probably everyone knows, and this guy probably everyone knows. But this is Bashar, the Syrian president after 2000. And actually, about 3 weeks ago, I saw news footage from inside this palace after the fall of the government, which kind of was a somewhat surreal experience to actually see the inside. Nobody's ever seen since Nixon. I don't think anybody's been in the family quarters. Nobody I know anyway, since that time. So in 2000, Assad died. This is a Time magazine cover from 1996 when Netanyahu was elected the first time. This was a stupid question in 1996, and it's a stupid question now, because Netanyahu campaigned in 1996 explicitly to destroy the peace process. This was his entire campaign. So for the Americans not to acknowledge this, to understand this, to realize this then or later or last year is, an oversight of historic and catastrophic consequences that has been made again and again and again. Assad he was accompanied, especially in the last 10 or 15 years of his rule, by progressively brooding cult of personality. And his giant photographs were everywhere, and you couldn't escape them. They were all over the country. And then suddenly in June of 2000, he was dead. And it was a surprise to everybody. And I was there, and no one knew what would happen. And then all of a sudden, his son seemed like the single best, only option. And he became president in a referendum. They changed the constitution so that a 34-year-old could become president before they become 35. And then there was a referendum. I didn't know anybody who bothered to vote. Nobody took the trouble. The year before, his father had a referendum, and I knew practically everybody I knew went to the polls. You were required by law to go. The new president made a speech. He said, all of these posters are against our human dignity. We're going to take them down. we're going to have a process of reform, but at our own pace. People were surprised. They were positive. They were optimistic, many people. And the posters did come down. This is the central bank. For most of the time that I knew it, it had a giant picture of Hafiz al-Assad there. And then he died, and the picture came down. But then a few years later, Bashar al-Assad's picture went up. He was the first of what an Arab comic called a Jumlukiya, or a republican monarchy. So it was the Syrian Arab Republic, but succession was by heredity. And so it was a monarchy in fact. He made some improvements. The streets were a little cleaner. People's salaries went up a bit. But mostly he accelerated corruption and made crony capitalism the rule of the day. And his family members and his cousins became enormously, unbelievably, obscenely wealthy. They built a suburb so that they could live outside the capital and be away from the ordinary folk. And the crony capitalists around the government of Bashar al-Assad after 2000 dismantled the socialist system, got rid of a lot of subsidies, stopped paying for decent schools and clinics and hospitals and roads in the countryside where most of the population lived. At the same time that climate change and drought was affecting the agrarian livelihood of millions and millions of people. And so they came to the cities, and they moved to Damascus and to Aleppo and lived in appalling conditions outside the cities. And so this is the events that drove the conditions that drove the emergence of the Syrian Revolution in 2011 during the course of the Arab Spring. A distaste and a disgust and a feeling that the system was corrupt and unjust, and that some people were becoming enormously wealthy and everybody else was becoming poor and more oppressed and more hopeless. During the course of the Arab Spring uprising and the revolution in the early stages, and all along really, the question that people asked was, what is a citizen? And to whom is the state? To whom does the country belong? And to Bashar al-Assad and to the people like him and around him and his family members, the answer was very clear. And they said it many times: the state and the country belongs to us. And we enjoy it, and you may live here, but we can get rid of you anytime we want, for any reason, at any time. And this, of course, was the same argument that the High Commissioner of the French Mandate had made. And Bashar al-Assad actually used the sectarian inheritance from the French Mandate to terrify the people of the country of their fellow neighbors and to stay in power. And by relying upon the Russians and the Iranians to defend his regime, he completely shattered the abiding goal of Syrian statecraft since the beginning, really, to not make the state a pawn of other powers. And so he became, in every way, and everyone realized this, a kind of a client, a vassal, if you like, of both the Iranian government and Putin's Russia. And the brittleness of his regime and the fragility of his rule, and the fact that he had no defenders and no one wanted him, and no one supported him at the end, I think is a kind of a fitting epitaph. And so now things look different. And there's a moment of hope and optimism and joy, I think, for lots of people, And we hope that that will be realized, and that people will not be disappointed or betrayed or let down. And they make the argument that the country belongs to its citizens, like every country should belong to its citizens, and not to its leaders, and not to the regime, and not to the crony capitalists, but to the people who live there, who are citizens in the country and have the right and the responsibility to determine its institutions and its structures and its destiny. And so this is what I've been hearing from my friends. I hope I can visit in about a month. I plan to. And so I'm going to show you one last slide, which is some cartoons from the great Syrian cartoonist Ali Farzad. You can see on the left here, this is Bashar al-Assad. This is his reality. This is his self-image. This is the politician or the army man stuffing money into the cannon while the beggar goes hungry and looks for food. And this is Ali Farzad's optimistic and hopeful cartoon that love will triumph over weapons and war and the hardware of conflict, destruction, and death. So we have to hope. So stay tuned. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much for a sweeping presentation and somehow distilling into 1 hour the history of the late Ottoman colonial and 20th century history of the Levant. So this is Levant month at the San Diego World Affairs Council. And obviously there are many, many, many different angles of which one needs to investigate this region to get a sense of not just the history, but also the various political realities. And just to announce, looking forward, on February 17th, the World Affairs Council is co-sponsoring the visit by Peter Beinart to San Diego State University, where he'll discuss his book, Being Jewish After the Destruction. This is a look back on Gaza and what this means for the Jewish community et al. Worldwide. On February 22nd, out at Balboa Park at the Hall of Nations, Wael al-Sawa will speak on Syria's crossroads, revolution, governance, and the future of leadership. Wael is very Syrian. For a period, he also worked in the political affairs office of the U.S. Embassy in Damascus, and he's been around and he's seen a lot. And on February 27th, Najat Aoun Saliba, a sitting member of the Lebanese parliament, she will be presenting to the San Diego World Affairs Council. That'll be a morning program, a bit on the early side on February 27th. And she will present on the very dynamic situation in Lebanon, where they're trying to form a new government and the wreckage of the Hezbollah, the Israeli Hezbollah war in the post-October 7, 2023 period. So it's a busy month for the San Diego World Affairs Council. Michael, thank you for setting the stage for these discussions and others that should be had. I'm gonna end the recording now, and we're going to move on to a Q&A period. So if you're interested in asking a question, please let me know in the chat or write your question in there. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Michael Provence. Thank you.